A lot of mixed reaction to that medium-term budget policy statement. Investors don't seem to agree with it as the rand has lost ground against the US dollar. Opposition parties aren't impressed either. But what does this all mean for you and me? Well, I'm joined this evening by a political economist we have in Pretoria. That's Siyabenisa, who is going to help us unpack this mini-budget. We're also expecting in our Cape Town studio, let me just give you an idea of who'll be joining us. Mpotshebe, also an economist, and then we've got Tessa Dooms, who'll be coming in shortly. She's a social analyst and managing director of the Youth Lab. But let's go to Pretoria, where we've got Siya. Siya, very good evening. If you can hear me clearly there, just your overall impressions. I mean, this really wasn't great news already. We already knew that we were an economy in crisis, but did you expect anything better or anything different or a bit more of a glimmer of hope from the Finance Minister today?
Sure. No, I didn't expect anything much better, and I think the minister has served quite a bitter pill for a lot of people. But what I do believe, though, it may not be enough to solve the domestic fiscal and developmental challenges, but I do definitely think that he spoke or maybe resonated with those in power, primarily if you think of credit rating agencies and other financial institutions whose rating of South Africa matters, particularly if you think of our spending profile or borrowing profile rather. And the view is quite grim. However, I don't think that the minister, also given his constraints, given the power and mandate that he has done sufficiently enough to not only just coordinate the government, but I think he's done enough to ensure that South Africa is on a path towards implementing fiscal consolidation. You might remember that we started on this path of fiscal consolidation during the first term of former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, his first term, but there was very little in terms of implementation in spite of his freeze of certain government posts at certain levels, particularly management, which has had the negative consequence of leaving certain high-level posts at the National Treasury unmanned, so to speak. But now with this second sort of set of budget or policy decisions, the Minister of Finance is really tying the hands of government agencies as well as other national departments, and also the major shift in terms of the appropriation of the budget being now focused not on local government in terms of municipalities and local municipalities, but rather focused on the district, which is likely to shake or at least shift the political economy at the local government level, with major significant ramifications. Yeah,
with reference to what you say about fiscal sustainability, let's take a listen to what the Finance Minister had to say, that we are still, that fiscal sustainability is still a very long way off, saying that that's despite all the cuts and belt tightening, saying at least 150 billion rand is needed in the next 3 years. And speaking of one way to achieve this will be to cut the salaries of government officials, public servants and politicians. And believe it or not, those have increased by 66% in the last 10 years. Let's take a listen to what he had to say there.
Analysis of spending on public sector wages. It shows that, it's an interesting figure actually, it shows that 29,000 public servants plus members of the National Executive, members of Parliament, members of the provincial executives and so forth, each earned more than 1 million rand last year. So they become millionaires. This is more than double the number of civil servants earning more than 1 million rand in 2006-07. So when members of the DA shout up and down, you must know that is because they are concerned about their status. The average wage increases across government was 6.8% in 2018-19, or 2.2% in above inflation.
All right, well, Siya, I have with me here my colleague from the Money Desk, Rafia Madzena. She has a couple of questions because she's been keeping an eye on the situation throughout the day from the time the speech started.
That's right.
What concerns you?
That's right, Vivek. And I mean, some things that have been said by Sia I find very interesting. Sia, just to pick your brain, so you say that the implementations that the minister looks to put in place are not sufficient, but the unions may argue that this cutting of the wage bill is something that they're going to fight tooth and nail. How does government, or Treasury rather, create that balancing act?
The focus, it needs to be a dual focus. That's the only way they're going to make a sustainable sort of compromise. At the moment, the minister is focused purely on the fiscal side in terms of the fiscal sustainability, but not really looking at the ramifications on the demand side, given that the National Treasury's mandate is to stimulate growth. And without demand, given the expected cut in wages, the growth's not going to be there. Without demand, there's not going to be the investment, at least not at the levels that are sufficient to stimulate growth. And so the only way to make a sort of worthy compromise is to look at this from both a fiscal side but also a demand side. Simplifying numbers such as saying a certain number of civil servants earn more than R1 million is to oversimplify the complex matter. We all understand that certain levels of tax, the tax bracket that those civil servants would be at is upwards of 40%, 45%. So really you're looking at half of that in terms of net take-home pay, and that's really what people have to deal with in order to stimulate demand. This is also the similar approach and tack that former Minister of Finance had when he was mentioning Gigaba, when he mentioned the 1 percentile increase in VAT, which was simplified as a 1% increase, when in fact, when you look at the prices on the shelves, a 1 percentile increase translates to a real increase of around 16 to 20% in terms of the net increase in the price of food. That has had a much more significant impact on demand, in spite of it being quite good or conservative on the side of the fiscus. And now, remember, we're dealing with 3 times the kind of shortfall we dealt with at the time when we were increasing VAT, when we were trying to fund free education and the like. Now we're talking over 150 billion rand that needs to be sort of closed using these types of measures. And so for me, they're insufficient, but also they're much more focused on the fiscal balance rather than looking at a dual position of not just the fiscus, but the demand impact of these types of policy recommendations.
Thanks for that, Siyabonisa. Still with us for the rest of our conversation. We will be continuing to look at and analyze this medium-term budget through till 7 this evening. Good evening. If you've just joined us, we're continuing our discussion now, just analyzing the Finance Minister's medium-term budget. It was not great news, we must tell you, if you missed it. Very ominous indeed, confirming, of course, that we do have a very, very sick economy, and it doesn't seem like we're going to be getting better anytime soon from what we heard from Tito Mboweni earlier. Well, we do have a panel of guests discussing this with us today. We've got Siyabonisa. He is in our Pretoria studios. He's a political economist. With me in studio is Tessa Doom. She's a political analyst with Jasura Consulting, and Mpotsebe, who is an economist in our Cape Town studio. Rafeel Madzena from our Money Desk joining the conversation. Tessa, I'd like to hear from you as somebody watching on the political front. What about this? I mean, we are in general concerned about this economy. I mean, we are in crisis. We don't know as ordinary consumers what to do. For you, what are the red flags from what you heard today?
So for me, I'm always looking out for the people in the lower LSMs, the lower income brackets in the country, and also those who are underemployed and unemployed, and what these budget outlooks mean for them. And I think there's 2 things that really stand out for me. The one is the question around social spending. And although social spending was mentioned, and that 3 trillion rand that we'll be spending in the next 3 years, the question about the return on investment on social spending, when it comes to health, when it comes to education, when it comes to social grants, when it comes to those places in the economy where we're trying to create social protections and social nets that are supposed to lift people out of poverty and give them a real fighting chance in the economy. And I don't think we have a clear understanding of where that 3 trillion rand is going to go in different ways and get different outcomes from what we've done before. It's not uncommon that we spend a lot on our social spending, as we should, in terms of a base, but I don't think we have a clear picture from this budget midterm budget speech about what outcomes we're expecting about that, because really the social outcomes aren't just about social well-being. They really are about economic outcomes at the end of the day, because social actors are the ones that are going to become the economic actors that create the wealth.
And in a week that we received these unemployment figures that are climbing and climbing and climbing, I would have expected to hear a little bit more about that as well.
I mean, I think if you look at the top 10 priorities, jobs is only one of them, and it was jobs specifically in agriculture and tourism.
Yeah.
And I think the idea that you can see through this is the idea that it's going to be companies and corporates that are going to be creating those jobs. Where it falls flat for me is if you're thinking about SMEs and you're thinking about the informal economy, where a lot of trade is happening in those spaces, but there's not a lot of vision and perspective around what we're going to get out of those sectors of the economy. So when we say agriculture and tourism, are we saying with a specific look at SMEs, a specific look at micro enterprises, things like township economies and tourism? So are we really thinking about the lower ends, or are we just thinking about investment from above? We're thinking about big companies, we're thinking about mass absorptions, when in fact every economy in the world has shown us it is the SMEs of our society. And particularly if you look at the countries that he mentioned in Africa, the informal economies of those countries are thriving, and ours isn't.
Well, ours should be. I don't know if we're actually concentrating on those enough. I mean, we've been banging on about that for months, Tessa. Thanks for that. Well, my colleague Rafiwa is also particularly concerned about the taxes, as are we all, Rafiwa. And I mean, you've been chatting to a lot of people about that, and we're supposed to expect more taxes next year. I don't know where I'm going to find it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's very little focus on things like SMEs, but a huge focus on tax and taxing us a little bit more. And Mpa, I just want to get your thoughts on the pronouncements that were made by the minister around tax and VAT, really not bringing in the revenue we'd like to see, VAT going mostly to refunding taxpayers. The outlook for the revenue provider, I mean, given that it provides around 25% to the country's GDP, what did you absorb from that?
Yeah, so I think the major problem regarding tax revenues is that it's a growth story. So we started the year expecting growth to be much higher than where it's currently sitting. So at the beginning of the year, we were looking at growth forecasts of around 1.5%. We're now sitting with growth likely to average 0.5% this year, if not lower. Now, that has had a major impact on revenue collections, and we're expecting tax revenues to fall short of initial estimates by about 52 billion this year, rising to around 82 billion next year and 117 thereafter. So those are huge major revenue shortfalls. And I think the other thing that was highlighted was that given the trajectory of the fiscus, the way it is, it's going to require further tax increases, unfortunately. So there will be some adjustment on the expenditure side, but unfortunately that's not going to be enough to stabilize the country's finances, so which means that consumers can expect further tax increases next year.
But Mpa, I find that very confusing for me, because we're going to be increasing. We just did that with VAT, with the 1% increase. And I've just mentioned that a lot of it goes back to tax refunds. When will we start to see the benefits of continuously taxing the taxpayer, given that VAT makes up a big bulk of revenue collection?
Yeah. So the other problem is that it's not only that you're collecting revenues and then it's going to VAT refunds. So that's a normal process, because if you think about it, is that VAT is paid by the end consumers. So corporates just play a middleman. They pay VAT when they purchase goods and services, they process them into final goods and then sell them to consumers, and then collect that VAT from consumers, which they then have to pay to SARS. So it's more of an input-output balancing act that corporates pay. They play the middleman, claim from SARS what they collected from consumers. So that's expected on the VAT refund side. And remember, we also had the SARS commission, where it was indicated that previously SARS was withholding tax refunds that they were supposed to be paying towards small, medium enterprises and corporates in general, which was then affecting their operations. So it's good that we're now seeing SARS is paying paying off those VAT refunds. They're no longer delaying them because it then affects the financial operations of other companies. But I think what's more of a negative picture is that if we look at how much is being collected in tax revenues and what that's being spent on. So if we look at the highest increasing item, the fastest increasing item on the expenditure side is interest costs. Now that's quite worrying because you're taking money from households and corporates. So corporates could be using that money to invest in infrastructure, which will be positive for the economy. Households, on the other hand, could be using that money much more productively as well, buying goods and services, which will also be beneficial for the economy. But if we then look at how that tax is being spent, it's not efficient. Firstly, it's being used to pay off debt. Some of it is foreign owned, which means that we have money leaving the economy. And then on the other hand, you also have a lot of wastage in government in general. Which then, talks to inefficient spending and inefficient allocation of finances.
And we'll continue to talk about that debt and the likes of Eskom and so